Good afternoon or good morning everybody. Welcome to today's webinar, which is all about working with Photoshop files or PSD files in Capture One 10.1. We'll also cover other file formats as well because the principle is exactly the same, but there's a couple of differences which I'll make you aware of. But primarily dealing with processing a Photoshop file out of Capture One, doing some stuff in Photoshop and getting it back in Capture One and moving on from there. So I'm going to show you quite a nice workflow with some client approval steps in there as well, and then hopefully you can integrate this into your own workflows too. If this is your first webinar and you don't know who you're listening to, my name's David. I'm part of the software sales team based out of Copenhagen in Denmark. As usual, we have an allocated 60 minutes, but this morning it only took about 45, so I imagine it will be pretty similar this afternoon as well. It's a relatively simple concept, so it doesn't really take an hour to explain it. You're very welcome and encouraged to ask questions throughout. If you're on your Mac or PC, at the bottom of your GoToWebinar control panel or web page, the last box you'll see is called questions. You can put a question in there that will come straight through to me. If you are on your Android or iOS device, there's a question mark icon at the bottom of the app. Tap that and you can ask a question in the same way. Try to keep your questions on today's subject, not really for my benefit, but just for everybody else watching so we don't go off track. All right. Let's move on. Before we jump into Capture One, I might have used the phrase round trip earlier, and just to explain exactly what that is, or this process. So we have an image in Capture One and we'll finalize it, and then we'll create a PSD, a TIFF or JPEG or whatever. Today I'm primarily going to do PSD Photoshop file. Then we want to take that to our external editor. In this case it's going to be Photoshop, and do some additional work, retouching, or anything that's outside of the scope of Capture One, something that Capture One can't handle. But then, because Capture One is also an asset manager, we want to return that into Capture One so we can put it in our catalog or session alongside our original raw files. And this is very important, take that finalized file, a PSD, a TIFF or whatever, and do more to it in Capture One as well, and potentially repurpose it as JPEGs of various different sizes or TIFF files of various different sizes and so on. So that's the full workflow that we're going to do today. All right, so now we can go into Capture One. So let's come out of that, and just so you can see my cursor, it might be highlighted like this from time to time, so you can see it moving around the screen. All right, now I'll run through this twice. The first time I do it, we will cover it sort of relatively slowly, so you can see it step by step. And then we go through it fast again, so you can see, even though it looks a bit drawn out, you can cover this off really, really quickly. All righty. Okay, so let's start the workflow like so. Just need to help an Icelandic man by the looks of it who's not getting any sound. So I just need to tell him to check his prefs or exit and enter again. And then I will be with you. Okay, all right, so let's pick an image. Let's go for this one. So we've got an image here in Capture One. It's been finalized as far as we can. So now we want to continue on our workflow in Photoshop, for example. So what we need to do is initiate the edit with process. So this starts off the round trip procedure that we mentioned before. So if I right click either on the thumbnail, or if you don't have the thumbnails available, you can right click on the image itself, and you will see two options here, edit with and open with. Open with we're going to look at in the workflow as well. The important thing between these two is that edit with will always create an additional file and place it adjacent to the raw file. Open with simply opens this file into an editor of your choice, which we will come back to. So hold that thought. Okay, so let's right click and say edit with. Now a dialog pops up with the compatible formats and so on that we can do a round trip process with. So we can do TIFF, PSD and JPEG. Now I did some Googling around about when should you use PSD and TIFF. Doesn't seem to be a definitive answer. It's all down to personal preference and some options that are not available in TIFF and some that are in PSD and so on. But this works perfectly with TIFF and layered TIFFs as well. So if you're not a PSD user but you're a TIFF user, then just pretend that all of this is being done on a TIFF because it will work in exactly the same way. So let's say PSD, I just do an 8-bit for just speed and convenience here. We can choose our ICC profile, our scaling, which I'll just keep to 100%, so it's full size. And here we can choose our external editor to then open that new file into. Now, as I said, I'm using Photoshop. This could equally be something like Affinity Photo or Pixelmator, but you might have to do one extra step, which I'll mention when we come to it. So Affinity people out there, hold that thought and I'll mention it when it's necessary. In the Adjustments tab, we can also do a couple of useful things like ignore the crop, which is sometimes good if you're going out to retouch. Excuse me. And we can apply additional sharpening if we need to. Excuse me. But we're not going to do that today. So we're just going to take our file into Photoshop like so. So now all I have to do is say edit variant. Now this is a single image operation. If you want to do a batch out to Photoshop, we'll also cover that later as well. So this Roundtrip workflow is just for a single image. So let's say edit variant. If we look at our activity window, oh, it's gone over on the other monitor. Here we go. We just bring it over quickly. See my variant is being exported. If we're fast, we might see it just pop up underneath. Nope, Photoshop was too quick, but we'll come back to it. Okay, so now we've got our file in Photoshop and I need to do some additional retouching. So to prove that we can work with layers as well, then I'm going to make a new layer down here and call this retouching. Please bear in mind, I'm not a retoucher, so the retouching demo part's going to be pretty terrible, but it's all about principle. So we see we've got an error here which we want to retouch. So let's just grab my healing brush tool and do some bad retouching over here. See if I can improve on the terrible job I did this morning, probably not by much. Like so, and you get the idea. And what else? Let's just fill in. Oh, we've got a bit of a spot there, so let's just do a bit on like this and like that. Okay, so whoops, that wasn't too good. So we've done some retouching, you get the idea. So now I need to close this file down and say save, because we want to save my PSD file. Very important step next, we've got maximize compatibility must be checked on for this to work properly with Capture One. So must be checked on. So let's say OK, and that'll save. Let's go back to Capture One. And now you can see here's the original EIP. And if we look under here, we've got now my Photoshop file with the retouching, like so. Les says, does open with take the adjustments made in C1 to Photoshop? No, 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 no. All it does is open that file into the external editor of your choice. No adjustments or whatever. All you're simply asking, if we say open with, right click, open with is to open that file in whatever editor you choose, totally disregarding anything that's going on in Capture One. So here we've got our PSD file, which is almost client ready, but we have a super fussy client and they're not entirely sure what look they want to have. So we're going to make some new variants of this PSD. So I can do that by saying new variant. You can use your shortcut if you wish. So let's make 1, 2, and let's make a third. Why not? So now these are virtual copies. Remember, we're not duplicating the PSD file at all. So we're not writing loads of data to the disk, it's just a virtual copy. So there's my original PSD as it came from Photoshop. And then we've made 1, 2 virtual copies Oh no, there's my original, and we made 1, 2, 3 virtual copies. So let's open these up like so. They all look identical, of course, but we have our super fussy client and they really don't know what they want. So let's give them some options. So let's have a black and white image like so. So let's have a black and white. Let's also have a black and white, but we're gonna go hipster old school and add some film grain as well. So let's just zoom those up together. Let's add some grain like so on the central image. So now we've got a grainy one. Shift click on the little head to zoom them all back out. Then on the third one, let's throw in a color grade with the color balance tool. So let's just have ourselves some cool shadows or something like that. So now we've given ourselves, if I option click the reset button, we've just given ourselves some nice cool shadows, for example. So now we've got 3 different looks. And we want to send these off to our clients so they can approve them. So let's go to our process recipes and let's make a new recipe, which we're going to use specifically to send off to our client and use a nice new feature in 10.1, which is watermarking as well. So I'm going to make a new process recipe and let's call this client proof share like so, brackets Dropbox like so, and you'll see why in a minute. So right, we want to have JPEG quick proof. Remember, we're repurposing the Photoshop file, but with 3 different kind of looks, all within Capture One. Let's go to sRGB, for example. The quick proof simply uses the embedded preview file in Capture One. So it's really fast and we don't have to do any much processing on it at all. Now in the File tab, currently by default it's set to output location, which means in this case it will go to the output folder of this particular session. The same principle is working in a catalog as well, except you will have to define that output location as there's no default in the output location tool. But instead of sending it there, I'm going to choose a folder. So I'm going to say select folder and pick my Dropbox and go to my shared folder, which I've already set up with my client. Well, you see there's some images in there from this morning, so I'll get rid of those in a minute. So this particular process recipe goes straight to my Dropbox folder. Let's just open Dropbox and get rid of those old pictures from this morning so it doesn't confuse us, and carry on. Now also, because this is the same file but we've got 3 different variants, we want to help our client and use a watermark to show them exactly which variant is which. Because otherwise when I export it, they're just going to have all the same file name and he is going to say, well, I like the black and white one, and then you'll have to say, what, the black and white one with grain and without grain? And then you're going to have a continued conversation back and forth, so let's make it easy from the outset. So we want to add a text watermark. And instead of writing text, we're going to use a token. And you'll find tokens all over Capture One, naming convention, output destinations, all kinds of things. And they simply refer to some kind of metadata in the image. So first of all, we're going to use the image name. Now, if I start typing, a list of the tokens pops up like so. Now, if you don't know what your tokens are called, you can click on this box, this one here, and you'll get a whole list of tokens. But I want to have image name, like so. So that will use the image name for each image. Now that font is way too big, so let's change my font size down to something a bit more sensible. Hopefully that's about right. Yep, there we go. And bump up the opacity so we can see it. Now my first issue, of course, is that they all have exactly the same name. So as I said, that really doesn't help our client very much. So let's use another token, which is called variant position, like so. Now we've got a 2, a 3, and a 4. But that's, again, not very easy to read. So in between those tokens, I'll put an underscore and VAR for variant, like so. So then we've got variant 2, variant 3, variant 4. Nice and easy for our client to understand that. Now let's also drag this slider and we put it up the top so it's not covering her face. and anything else non-essential. Great. So a nice process recipe with that. Once we've set up, we can keep it as is. So now I need to process those out. Also in the output location, remember that's going direct to Dropbox. Output naming, we're going to do the same thing just in case, because we don't want all the files to have the same name. So it's going to have image name, a V, and then variant position as well. Nice and simple. So let's go ahead and say process. Be nice and fast, almost instant, as you can see. So now if I go and click on this little arrow, this will take me straight to the output destination. And there they are syncing to Dropbox like so. Now, of course, if my client is set up on Dropbox as sharing this folder, they get a push notification that they've got stuff to look at, or they get an email that they've got stuff to look at, or you can simply call them and say, hey, dude, check your shared folder. There's some new images in there as such. Alrighty. So now pretend I'm the client. He or she will then open these up and have a look. So now we've got variant 2, variant 3, variant 4. So you can have a conversation, say, which one do you like? Now, if they're smart, what they could do, if they're not emailing you, they just want to do some quick markup on their phone or on their desktop, then they can turn on markup. I mean, this is in preview in Mac, but I'm sure Windows will do pretty much the same thing. Grab a pen and say, well, I really like this one, but you missed a bit of retouching there. I can see a stray hair down here. And maybe there's something going on with the faces as well. This one with the grain, nah, I don't like that so much. But the color one, you know what? I'll have this one as well. So that's just one example, of course, if they want to do markup, but they could just as easily email you, okay, I want variant 2, variant 3, etc., etc. Okay, let's close those down. They're going to be resaved and syncing nicely. Back to Dropbox again. So let's go back to our original PSD, like so. So what did our client say? Well, let's have a look. Let's open these back up. Okay, he or she, likes variant number 2, and it looks like variant number 4, but oh look, I've screwed up some retouching, not surprisingly as well. Now, as hopefully I put the variant name in the file number as well, I can find variant number 2 and just show you something which you may or may not find interesting. First of all, I don't want the watermark there on anymore, so I just deviate away from that process recipe. I know I'm going to do TIFFs next, for example. Let's collapse down some tools. And I placed earlier the overlay tool in Capture One as well. So if I drag and drop that JPEG in there and turn it on as an overlay, I can see exactly what mistakes I made. Oh, okay, like so. If I don't want to have another window open with the errors in. So now, Les, back to your question. We want to open up our PSD back into Photoshop and fix those mistakes that I did. So let's open that back up. And remember, if I turn on my overlay, okay, I need to fix this bit and this bit and this bit. Okay, so let's go back to my retouching layer. See, it's still present. Capture One doesn't flatten it or anything like that. Zoom in a bit. Let's do some more bad retouching, like so. Told you it was going to be bad. Some more bad retouching. What else was it? Oh, hairline down here. So let's do that. Helps if we actually remove the error, not make it worse. But again, this is all about principle. That's why I'm not a retoucher. So we're going to fix that. And our client also complained there was something strange going on down here. Anything else? Let's just fix a couple of jumper holes so it's really obvious when we go back to Capture One, like so. Okay. So we're happy with that. We've done more amazing retouching. So let's close this back down, save, back to Capture One. See, it's now rebuilding the preview. Let's turn off our layer and you see now we fixed here, we fixed our hairline, and we did changed a few holes in the jumper and so on and so forth. See, if we go back to the original raw file, we can see without retouching and now with retouching like so. Now the good thing is, because we made those variants from the Photoshop file, they also contain that retouch as well, which is nice. So what did our client like? Let's refresh our memory again. They liked variant 2 and variant 4. So now we can choose variant 4 and choose, variant 2 and variant 4. So that was our final selection. Now, if you haven't seen this before, I just mention it. Edit, select by file name list. So let's say you've got loads of images that you need to do a select on. If your client emails you back a list of file name numbers, you can simply copy paste them in here and Capture One will select them for you. So you then don't have to search through a whole bunch of images. So just remember, edit, select by, file name list. Very, very useful feature. Alrighty, Abbott's question. I was happy until David's just made comment. Uh-oh, what did I say? What if I want to round trip to Photoshop Affinity and use my C1 adjusted variant as the starting point? Yeah, you can do that too. There's nothing to stop you doing that. So if we did right click edit with, then it would come in as a black and white, okay? But this way we've got our original and then we went back to Photoshop and then we could grade or black and white on that. But yes, Abbott, you could do exactly the same thing. Don't worry. This is just one way of doing it, but you could edit with and it would come with all the Capture One adjustments. And Grant missed the difference between edit with and open with. Yes, so it's really important that you get this. So remember, if you say edit with, however the image looks in Capture One, it will create an additional TIFF, Photoshop or JPEG, place that alongside the raw file and open it in the editor of your choice. If we say open with, all we're asking Capture One to do is to open that file into the editor of your choice. No additional file is created. So that's why in our workflow we did open with, because we needed to open our Photoshop for the second time, Photoshop file for the second time, and do some additional retouch. But we'll whiz through it all again in one more stage so we can see it. So what did we finish up with? We had variant 2 and variant 4. That was our final client select. So now we can have a nice full-size TIFF in our process recipe. It's going to our output location, which is defined here. And we're going to ask Capture One to dump it in a folder by the recipe name. And our output naming, we're going to have our variant position mentioned in there too. So the client knows if they really can't remember which is which, then it's in there too. So let's go ahead and say process. Click on the arrow here to go to our output location, like so. And now we've got a automatically made folder called a full-size TIFF 8-bit, and then we've got variant 2. So the client can always correlate it, and variant 4 like so. Easily done. Ron says, can you save edit with recipes? No, you can't, but it's not a silly suggestion. What Ron is saying, excuse me, if we were to say edit with, that whatever you set here should be sticky. Currently it defaults to TIFF 16-bit, because previously there was only TIFF and JPEG, and we thought most people would round trip with TIFF 16-bit. But now we've got PSD, it was kind of overlooked to make that sticky. But it's not a silly suggestion, so that would kind of make sense to change that in a future version of Capture One. Okay, so that was our workflow. So let's do it again with a different Anne-Sophie. So this is an image as far as we've got into Capture One, and now we need to do some additional stuff to it. So right click, edit with. We're going to have a PSD file, and we're going to have Photoshop. We want to open with Photoshop, and I'll tell you if you're using Affinity the extra step you'll need to do in a minute. So open with Photoshop and say edit. Capture One will process a new variant. If we're quick, we can see the activities window. We might see it pop up. It depends how fast Photoshop opens. Oh, too quick. There we go. So now we've got Photoshop that opens up. Let's make a new layer just to prove that Capture One doesn't screw up the layers. Call that retouch or e-touch. Retouch. Let's find something we need to fix. Okay, here we go. Healing brush. Again, let's do another terrible job of fixing this. You'd never know it was there, right? Important that we just see some kind of change. Let's get rid of little blemish here, little blemish there, little blemish here, and worse than that blemish there, for example. Anything else? Oh look, we've got a little hanging thing going on here, but we do that in stage 2. Okay, so I think great, we've done enough of our retouch here. Let's close it, say save, make sure maximize is on, say okay, it saves, we go back to Capture One, and here we see my saved PSD file like so. If we look at the original raw file, sorry, this one here, and then we go to this one, you can see the change in the retouch. Just a clue, look for the bit of stray wool on the jumper there. It's there in the raw file, it's not in the Photoshop file. But we have our fussy client, they want a few different looks, so let's make new variants. So let's do let's do 2 new variants just this time. So let's do our original color and a black and white, like so. Highlight them both. We've already got our process recipe set up, which is our client-proof Dropbox to share. So it's already nicely set up with the file name and the variant number. Let's process those out, like so. Let's go to our Dropbox. Here they are, this one here, number 7 and number 7. Our client is going to open them up now that they've got a notification. Say, okay, do we want black and white or color? You know what? I like this. I'm going to have this one as black and white, but you missed a retouch there. Terrible retouching. So I'll close this back down. Close that one as well. That gets retouched. Sorry. That gets resynced to Dropbox. Client gives me a call and says, hey, I did some markup and I put those images back in Dropbox for you. I really like variant number 3. So, okay, let's go to variant number 3, this one. And apparently there's some markup that I need to look at. So let's drag and drop this onto overlay. Turn on the overlay. Oh, yep, I just made a mistake there. So now I can right click on it and say open with Photoshop. Here it is. My layer is still intact, as you can see. Let's zoom in, fix the retouch, option click, like so. Again, you'd never know it was there. You can tell I'm not a retoucher, right? Yeah, so let's go with that. Close that down, resaves it, back to Capture One, and you'll see the preview updates. I can turn off my overlay now, and now my little chunk of wool is now updated on all those variants. If you're using Affinity Photo, you might find that the preview doesn't update automatically when you've returned to Capture One. So what you need to do then is say regenerate previews. So that will tell Capture One, if we say regenerate preview, you can see the progress bar there. It will look at the it will look at the PSD file or the TIFF file and then create the correct preview. On Photoshop, this happens automatically, but even though certain applications are writing the same file formats like TIFF and JPEG, they actually close them in a slightly different way. So with Photoshop, we can detect when it's closed or updated, but with some applications, we can't. Okay, so in theory, you can round trip with anything, edit with. You just might have to specify it here if it doesn't pop up there. Now going to Brenda's question, can I do this with more than one photo for head swaps? Very good question. The round trip is designed to be done on one image to go back and forth. If you need to do a batch of stuff, then what you could do, if we select 1, 2, 3, for example, 1, 2, 3, so we've got 3 images, then what I would do is make a process recipe like so, called PSD export, and then name it open with Photoshop, like so. And then all we have to do in your process recipe is say open with Photoshop. So when you process those out, let's do that right now. Let's say process, like so, la la la. It'll take a little bit longer, says he. Did I actually set the process going? Yes, I did. And then you can use whatever you need to do. So there's the first image coming up to do the second. See, that was it automatically opening. See, we're in capture one. When this one completes, any second now, going to call me a liar in a second, then it opens in capture one. And then if we go, sorry, Photoshop, if we go back to capture one, watching our progress bar down here, when this one completes, like so. So now we've got our 3 images in Photoshop, and you can do what you need to do, merging, head swapping, etc., if you wish. So if you're doing more than one image, then it makes sense to do a batch like that. Russell asked a while ago, is this for PSD and not PSB? Yes, it's just for PSD currently. PSB, if you don't know, is Photoshop Big, very imaginative name for files that are over, correct me if I'm wrong, Russell, I think it's 2 gigabytes or maybe 4 gigabytes. Certainly with higher megapixel cameras these days, if you have lots of layers, you can get over that, you know, relatively quickly. This is only 180 megabytes, for example. But PSB might make sense for us to look at in the future, but as always with any software development, it always comes in stages. But if you find yourself using PSB, let us know, and that could be something we could be doing in the future. Let's see. When exporting in the process summary dialog box, occasionally the size is displayed in red. Why is that? That's a good question. I don't know, Russell. The recipe can be displayed in red. I've never seen the size displayed in red. If it's in red, it means that you've selected a recipe, but it's not activated, as you can see. See, like so. But I've never seen the size in red. I have to keep an eye out for that. Maybe that's what you meant. How did you close out of Photoshop? I just Command W or just close the image. So look, if we do a retouch on this one, I won't bother, and we do this, blah, 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 retouch, 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 and so on. I just do Command W or just close the window and say save. Okay, like so. So that works too. With Roundtrip, remember it's automatically returned to your catalog or session. If you're doing a batch like this, Capture One won't necessarily pick up that you want those to be noticed in the catalog or session. So in a session, what you might want to do is if you go to the output folder and say show in library, so you can see I've got my outputs here. Then if I want to, all I need to do is say add to favorites, say add to favorites, and then I can pick them up in my favorites here, like so. For example, in a catalog, if you save them to a folder, then you just want to resynchronize that folder. Another nice little handy option in a process recipe, as well as saying output location and selecting a folder, you can also tell the process recipe to save the image in the same location as the raw file, so image folder. So if you always want to keep your exports and raw files in the same folder in your catalog, you can always tell the process recipe to save them back in the same spot. Okie dokie. Gerard says, what if by accident you use clone instead of new variant? Is it all lost? Well, actually, in this case, I don't think it would matter. In this case, with the PSD, you'd have exactly the same result if we said new variant or clone variant, I think, because our first PSD just looks exactly like the raw file, so whether we said new or clone really doesn't make any difference. If we said new variant from this one, it would be in color. If we said clone, it would be in black and white. So just think of it like that. And yes, Abbott, to clarify, if you use the edit with dialog, edit with, where are you? If you use the edit with dialog, the file is automatically returned to the same location of the image folder. If you're using a process recipe for more than one image, it's up to you to define where it goes based on the process recipe. Are the return files flattened TIFFs? They're whatever you specify them to be. Did you see these come back as flattened TIFFs, John? No, they came back as Photoshop files as indicated here, PSD. So the return file is whatever you specified it to be, and it is not flattened. But of course in Capture One you cannot see Photoshop layers because it's not Photoshop. Okay. If you're doing an HDR with 3 to 7 images, then you would use a process recipe like this, where you ask it to open within Photoshop, and then whatever you're using in Photoshop, let's say we were using, hang on, let's get some PSD. So let's say open with Photoshop, and then there's another PSD, open with Photoshop. So we've got 2 Photoshop files here. If you're doing an HDR merge or stitch or whatever, we could say automate photo merge, and then use the currently open files like so. So that's for stitching, but I'm no stitching / HDR expert, but you wouldn't round trip with that. You would use a process recipe and open them with Photoshop like so. Now there's one exception to this, one exception. If you are using Helicon Focus for focus stacking, then you can select, let's say we had this was a focus stack, you can select a multiple image, say edit with, and round trip to Helicon Focus. I don't have it installed, but that way Helicon Focus will open up all those images and it will return your stacked focus composite again into the same location as the raw files. So Helicon Focus is the exception if you want to do batch work with the edit with round trip option. And just remember, if you're an Affinity Photo person or perhaps any other external editor that isn't Photoshop, when your Photoshop or TIFF or JPEG gets returned to Capture One, you might need to say File, Regenerate Previews. Okie dokie. Les says, when an image is cropped, the size of the image is sometimes displayed in red. Yes, correct. The size here, because that probably means your process recipe has specific dimensions which do not match the cropping ratio of the image itself. So this one here, for example, if I suddenly said this dimensions of this image should be 5 by 4 inches, this is red because the ratio doesn't match. So that's why you see the red size there sometimes. It's just a warning to tell you something isn't right. Okie dokie. That pretty much brings us to that sort of round trip workflow. If you want to kind of see the written version of that, what I can suggest you do is if you go to blog.phase1.com, scroll down a bit and read through this here. So this basically tells you in written form what we just did in short form as such. So basically the bullet points of what you need to do. So that's blog.phase1.com, PSD asset management and round trip workflow. So that's a good resource, or you can also watch the recording of this as well, of course. Okay. Just check your last bit of questions. Roger says, could you do that with On1 RAW? Why would you want to use On1 RAW when you have Capture One? If you're using On1 RAW for maybe TIFF editing or other effects, then again, there's no reason why you can't use any external editor. It's just optimized for Photoshop. With good reason, because I'm sure if you poll every single Capture One user out of there, 80 to 90% of those are going to be using Photoshop as their external editor. Okay, alrighty. Oh, special effects, Roger says. There you go. Excellent. So what the last thing I'm going to finish with is just remind you of what's going to happen next week. It's a bit of a self-indulgent webinar next week. So recently I was on a trip out to the US, Utah, Arizona, Colorado, a couple of other places, shooting great subjects like Monument Valley. Not always in the best lighting conditions, so it was a really good lesson in what's possible to go from out of camera to a final edit purely in Capture One. So I was with a lot of people who use Capture One, but pretty much got into Photoshop as fast as possible. So by showing a few techniques of what's possible in Capture One, we convinced a few more to do more in Capture One as opposed to Photoshop. So that will be June the 1st, looking at a bunch of images from that trip. Again, very hazy skies, often very windy, often dusty. There's only so many hours of the day where you're in sunset or sunrise. For the rest of the time, you have to make do with what weather presents itself and lighting conditions and so on. So if you're a lazy landscape photographer like myself, you shoot throughout the day and hope you get something which you can improve on in Capture One. Like this was shot at 12:15, I think, which is probably the worst time for doing landscape photography. But thanks to clouds, it actually worked out all right. Okay, so I hope you can join me for that. Look out in roughly 24 hours time. You'll find a link to our YouTube channel. Please subscribe and then you'll get a notification when the recording goes up, which will be sometime tomorrow, I'm sure. So many thanks for your time today. Hope that gives you some inspiration of what's possible with not only Roundtrip, but also using those variants, tokenized watermarking, and a few other bits and pieces as well. Take care, everybody. Have a great Thursday and see you all soon. Take care.